Welcome back to the HTML5 project training series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to be into our 3D transforms. This is part 6 of the series, and we're going to be building an animated 3D cube in this particular portion of the tutorial. So in part 6 of our tutorial series, we'll continue our journey in the transforms that are part of CSS3, and we're going to build an animated 3D cube that is completely driven by CSS3. The animation and the three-dimensional concepts are all part of the CSS3 spec, and we'll actually be doing the whole thing in CSS3. No JavaScript, none of that. Everything's going to be run in CSS3. So let's go ahead and move into our development environment and demonstrate the new 3D transforms in CSS3. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation environment. Let's get into our development environment. I want to confirm that I've got my Apache web server up and running, which we do inside of our development environment. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring up Sublime Text 2, and I'm going to bring up Firefox, which is going to be our web browser of choice. What I'm going to do first thing I want you to notice is I want to demonstrate what we plan to build in this particular exercise. You'll notice we've got a three-dimensional cube. It's set up to look like a dice. You'll notice it's actually animating on our stage. And if you look real close, you can actually see through these corners. I've actually done this on purpose. You can actually see through the corners to the far side of the cube, so you can see the other background cubes as this thing rotates on the 360-degree axis. What I want you to be aware of is that this is actually all being done with CSS3. That includes the animation. So the animations are being done in CSS3, and the actual three-dimensional cube is created with the CSS3, and that's what we're going to go ahead and do in this particular exercise. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get out of that particular development environment. I want to go ahead and load up our start file for this particular demonstration. And I've got my start file loaded inside Firefox. Firefox will be the browser we'll be using for this demonstration. This way I won't need to use any fallback styling as we work through the exercises, because Firefox is using the transform elements without any web rendering prefixes, which is really good. So we're actually going to go through this using Firefox, and then I'm going to show you how you can actually do the web rendering stuff as we get towards the end. Do keep in mind that if you plan to deploy the solution to a live website, you'll need to use fallback coding for older browsers, and even some of the recent browsers that do not yet fully support all the aspects of the transform property in CSS3. So you've seen what we plan to complete. One thing I do want to point out, and that is I want to show you the directory, because I actually have some stuff in here that we're going to be using in this exercise. All right, so I want to go ahead and bring up the web root directory where we're actually performing this exercise. And I want you to notice I have an images folder in here, and inside my images folder, I have the images that you saw produced inside our demonstration of what we are actually creating. These are actually 200 by 200 pixel images that I created using Fireworks for this particular demonstration. You don't have to have images if you don't want to. You can use whatever you want inside your cube structure. If you have access to the download files, or if you have access to the exercise files, you'll actually have these images in the exercise folder. So I'm just letting you know this is what I have. They're 200 by 200. I actually produced these with Fireworks, but there's an actual very good graphics program called gimp.org, and I'm actually going to show you the website, which is an excellent graphics program. It's free. A lot of web designers actually use it for stuff that they do on their websites. Let me go ahead and show you that website. I'm going to go ahead and bring up that website. It's www.gimp.org. Excellent graphics program. It is as powerful, in my opinion, as Photoshop, and actually does a lot of things Photoshop doesn't do, because you can actually uniquely configure the interface to work the way you want it to work. So it is a free program. You can donate if you wish to. It's very, very good. It gets updated all the time. It's open source, so it's constantly being updated. A lot of good things, and there's also a lot of good video tutorials on how this works and what you can do inside this application. Right now they're on version GIMP 2.8. I actually have used this quite a bit. I've used this myself as a graphics program, especially when I'm on the road. If I don't have access to my developer suite from Adobe, I actually will use GIMP. A lot of good information on it. There's a lot of good tutorials on it. If you don't have access to a good graphics program, I would recommend that you go ahead and download GIMP at www.gimp.org. Again, they're up to version 2.8. Really good piece of software if you need something to work with your graphics files. And again, like I said, we're actually going to be using some graphics with this particular application as we develop it, and they're in the images folder. You'll see me actually refer to it when we start putting in our HTML code. Again, 200 by 200. I've got them as .pngs. You can use whatever kind of graphics you want. I actually like .pngs because I like the transparent backgrounds. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and close out that web root directory. First thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and add some HTML code to our document. I've got my open start file started inside my text editor. I'll be using Sublime Text 2 as my text editor for this demonstration, and I'm also going to be doing all the demonstration inside of Firefox. So the first thing I want to do is get in my HTML code. I'm going to go ahead and put this in, then we'll sit and discuss it, and you can actually get yours typed in. I want to do a save as. I'm going to go ahead and save this as example_1.html. And again, you'll have access to all these. If you have access to the exercise files, I'm going to go ahead and go back, refresh, and actually load the example_1 into my folder. And you'll see now we've actually brought these 6 images into our screen. But what we've done is I've got a standard HTML5 doc type. I've given it a title of our 3D cube. Inside my head section, I went ahead and set up in the body element, I've got a div with an ID of container that actually is going to enclose all of our elements that are actually inside the body tag. Then I have another div with an ID of cube, and inside that div I actually have 6 image files, and each one of those goes to our images folder and loads my 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.png files. I've given each one of my images a class of face and then an individual ID of F1 through F6, and that's basically face 1 through face 6, and that's so we know which side is facing out at us as this thing starts to begin to rotate, so I can individually address some styling for each one of those. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. Again, this is standard HTML scripting. There's nothing fancy here. The only thing I probably should have done, or would have because it's more of an HTML thing now for HTML5, I actually should have made this div a section, because this is actually more of a section than a div now. So I'm going to go ahead and save that change in my example 1. It's not going to change anything inside of our browser, but it's more semantically correct with HTML5 because this is actually going to be a section of that web page. Great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in, and then we're going to get started with actually starting to style this particular cube. All right, so we've got all the HTML in. It's pretty much standard HTML. I want to go ahead and do a save as. I want to save this because I want to save this in steps as we go through this in the event that you want to make changes to it and you have access to the exercise files. I'm going to save this as example_2.html. Then I'm going to go back into my web root, refresh, and load up example2. Should be no changes because we haven't made any changes yet for this particular example. The first thing I want to do is I want to go up into the head section of my document, and as we've discussed in the past, I'm actually going to do the styling inside the head section of the HTML document, so it's going to be an embedded style sheet. And the reason being, again, I think it's easier because we're not flipping back and forth between different pages. This way it's easier for you to follow along. Under normal circumstances, I would actually have this as an attached style sheet to this particular HTML document. So the first thing I'm going to do, let's go ahead and open up our style tags. I'm going to come down a couple lines and then close my style tags. And inside that particular, the style tag, the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and style our body element. So the first thing I want to do is add a body element to my actual styles. And I want to give it a background color. And actually I'm just going to give it a background color of black. And the only reason I'm doing this, I think it makes it easier for you to see how things are occurring as we set this up. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that change. Good time to pause if you want to type that in. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my browser window, and you should see now that we've gotten a background that's actually black. Very, very simple styling. Again, we're just basically taking the background property inside of our body element and giving it a styling of black. Now what I want to do is I want to actually start addressing the face class of my actual images. Keep in mind now each one of these images has a class, and I've assigned it a class of face because that's going to be the face of that particular die as we start setting it up. So I'm going to come in here and I'm actually going to address the face class. So I'll start it with a period telling me that we're actually going after the class with the name of face. And the first thing I want to set up in there is a position. So I'm going to give it a position of absolute. And we'll talk about why we did absolute in a minute. I'm going to give it a height of 200 pixels. I'm going to give it a width of 200 pixels. I'm going to go ahead and set up a padding of 10 pixels. And keep in mind now, if you understand the box model, that's 10 pixels entirely around this particular face, or this particular, in this case, it's going to be this image. So keep in mind, by doing that, our images now have become 220 pixels high and 220 pixels wide, because we have 10 pixels on each side, and we have 10 pixels on the top and the bottom when we add 10 pixels of padding like we have. And then I want to go ahead and add a background color to this also. So I'm going to give it a background color, and this is going to be an RGBA because I actually want to have some transparency here. So I'm going to say RGBA, and inside my parentheses, I'm going to give it 90, comma 90, comma 90, comma 0.4. So again, I've got 90, comma 90, comma 90, and then 0.4 for my alpha. I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes. Let's go ahead and scroll up just a little bit. Good time to pause if you want to catch up and type that in. Shouldn't see anything going on relatively right here. Let's go ahead and do a save. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my browser window. And you'll notice the only thing you notice now is that everything now has become stacked. All 6 of my images now are stacked on top of one another. And that's why we use that position of absolute. It puts them in exactly the same position, each one of them. And pretty soon we're going to start adjusting them so we can actually get them to do the things we need them to do as far as setting up for a 3-dimensional cube. The next thing I want to do is I want to address my ID of container, because this is only going to work, by the way, if it's included in a container. So I'm going to put my ID container, open and close my curly braces. I'm going to put a margin of 80 pixels. So that's 80 pixels all around, again, because we're using this shorthand notation. I want to give this a perspective. And again, now we're starting to get into that 3-dimensional stuff of 800, and that with a semicolon, and I want to give it a perspective origin. So we have perspective origin, and if you remember from our earlier exercises, we talked about this, and that's why we're using this parent element. We want to use this parent element as the perspective. All right, so we're going to go ahead and put in that perspective origin, just like we talked about in the previous tutorials, and I want it at 50%, and then 110 pixels. And again, the 110 pixels is because with our padding and our width, we actually have 220 pixels. So the perspective origin is going to be half. I want it right in the center of our item, of our image. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. I'm going to go ahead and refresh our browser window. And you'll notice now we've picked up that 80 pixels of padding, and we've moved it to the center. So the next thing we'll be doing is actually starting to set up the individual cubes and then the transitions from our different faces. So I'm hoping now that the more that we're using these new transform and perspective properties that are part of CSS3 for 3D space, I'm hoping you're getting more and more used to seeing them and how they're going to be used inside of our HTML documents. Next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and identify this cube and start doing the styling for the cube itself. And remember, the cube is what actually holds, that's the container that's actually holding our 6 images. So again, we've got a container that holds everything on our stage, in our browser window. Then I've got a cube that's actually holding the 6 images, and now we're going to go ahead and set up the styling for that particular cube. So I'm going to hit my ID of cube, opening and closing curly braces, and that's cube, not kib. I don't even think kib is a word. All right, the first thing I want to do is, again, give it a position. I'm going to give it a position of relative because it's a relative to its parent element, which in this case is the container. I want to set a margin, 0 top and bottom, auto left and right. And for anyone that's familiar with how that margin works, that's going to center our cube inside of the container element. I want to give it a height of 220 pixels. And again, keep in mind that our actual graphic itself is 200 pixels, but because we have 10 pixels of padding, that's 10 pixels of padding top and bottom, right and left. So it's going to make the height 220 pixels, and it's going to make the width 220 pixels. And again, if you have a good grasp of how the box model works, you'll understand why I'm actually adding those 20 additional pixels based on how we've set up our padding. Then I want to do my transform style. So I've got transform hyphen style. And here we want to do a preserve 3D. And we've actually used this one before. Again, it's one of the new 3D elements inside of CSS3. So again, transform hyphen style, preserve 3D. And the space, you notice I didn't leave a space there. I've noticed with some of the browsers that if you put a space there, it doesn't actually recognize it correctly. So I'm leaving the spaces out, and I'm doing that intentionally. So if you start to see that you're having a problem with your browser, check the spacing between the actual property and the value, because I've actually noticed that with a couple of them that I've seen so far working with the transforms. So, and again, transform. Now what I want to do here is I want to do a rotate, and this is going to be rotate X 0 degrees. And again, you'll notice I have no spacing between the colon and the rotate X. I will put a space here though, because I'm also going to do a rotate Y. And this rotate Y is going to be 20 degrees. And we're actually just setting up now how this cube is going to appear. Open and close the curly braces. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. I'm also going to go ahead and refresh my browser window, and you'll notice now that our cube has now been moved to the center of our screen. And now what I want to do is I actually want to start doing the styling for the individual faces. So remember, we have this F1, and we talked about each one of these has their own ID. So I open and close my curly brace, and the first thing I want to do is I want to do a transform. So I'm doing a transform colon rotate X, and this is going to be 90 degrees. And again, keep in mind I did not leave any spaces. Then I want to do a translate Z, and we actually use this in the last exercise, and this is going to be 110 pixels. And again, it's 110 pixels because it's half the distance of our actual item, which is 220 pixels. So I'm doing the translate to 110, because remember, these are going from the center point. So I want to move 110 pixels as I start rotating these to get them to the edge of the cube. So we're actually building this cube now. We're beginning the building of the actual cube. I'm going to do an ID for F2, and keep in mind now we've got these IDs have all been assigned to our individual items, our individual images. So now we're looking at item number 2, or image 2.png. That's going to be a transform. And the only one we're going to have here is a translate. This is going to be the translate Z, 110 pixels. So 110 pixels. And again, inside, that's inside our parentheses. Let's go ahead and save those changes. The next one we're going to do is going to be F3, and this is going to be, I'm going to go ahead and copy F1 now. C to copy that. I'm going to come right down below F2. I'm going to paste this in. This is going to be my F3 for my third face, which is image 3.png. And this one's going to transform, but it's going to rotate Y, because this one we're actually going to do on the side axis now. And we're going to rotate this 90 degrees on the Y axis. And again, translate Z, 110 pixels. I'm going to go ahead and copy that, come down right below it. I'm going to go ahead and paste that. I'm going to change this now. This is going to be face number 4. And that one's going to be rotate Y, but it's going to be 180 degrees. So hopefully you can see now how we're starting to position these faces around to build this cube. And again, the translate Z is going to be 110 pixels because again, it's only going halfway. I'm going to come down right below that. And I'm going to put my fifth face, or my ID F5. That's going to be transform rotate Y, but this one is going to be minus 90 degrees. So we're actually going to the other side now. Translate Z, 110 pixels. And I'm going to come down right below that, and I'm going to do our last one, which is going to be an ID of F6. Transform rotate X. So this is going to be our rotate X. I'm going to actually put this one at minus 90 degrees. translate Z, 110 pixels, but this one actually has an additional one. We actually have to do a rotate. (180 degrees). And I want to go ahead and save all those changes. So I'm going to go ahead and save all the changes that we've made. Let's go ahead and scroll up just a little bit. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type all that in. Then I'm going to go ahead and refresh the browser window, and you can actually see now we're actually starting to get these cubes that are spread all across our screen. I want to just check to make sure all my degrees are correct. So I've got my 90, my rotate X is 90, my rotate Y is 90, my rotate Y here is 180. I've got my minus 90, and I've got my minus 90. Cool. So all I need to do now is I actually have to go in and make certain, and actually what I want to do here, let's go ahead and do a save as. I want to save this as example3_3.html. Going to go ahead and refresh our browser window here. Load up example 3. Now what I need to do is I actually need to add the animation to go ahead and get this into an animated state where it actually starts to move now based on how we've got the cubes positioned inside of our HTML document. All right, so we're going to go ahead and now we're going to add the animation. I'm just looking through my code real quick because this just, my image looks bad, and I think okay, I see what I did. There should be a capital Z there. That should be a translate Z, not translate. Save the change, refresh the browser. There we go. Now the image is looking a little better. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as example_4, because now what we want to do is we actually want to add the animation that's part of CSS3 that's actually going to make this rotate as that cube that we talked about. So the first thing I want to do, and we'll talk about this as I put it in, I want to go ahead and add this into my cube itself. Right in the cube ID, right below where we have the transform rotate X and then rotate Y, right below that I want to add another line that's going to say animation, and then I want to do an animate to, which is going to be an ease in and ease out. It's going to last 20 seconds. It's going to go on forever, and it's going to alternate. What alternate means is when it gets to one end, instead of just jumping back to the beginning and starting again, it's actually going to go back and forth. So it's going to start, well, for instance, on once it's going to start on the right side, it's going to go through its animation, then it's going to start on the left and do its animation, just start on the right, and again it's going to run infinitely because that's the way we've actually set it up. And you'll see in a minute how we actually define this animation, because right below that I'm actually going to add another string of animation code. It's going to come right below our cube, and here's where we actually set up how the animation is going to run inside CSS3. What I've got add keyframes and animation to. That's actually this animation right here. This is where we're defining it. So we're telling it what this animation is. We've already told it it's ease in and ease out. It goes for 20 seconds. It runs infinitely, and it alternates. But here's what we're telling it. So from transform rotate 0 degrees. So we're going from 0 degrees. I want you to run 50% of your time. In other words, 10 seconds. To rotate 360 degrees, and then I want you to go back to 0. So we're basically telling it to take 10 seconds to go from 0 to 360, and another 10 seconds to go from 360 to 0. These can get very complex. I mean, if you go in and read the spec on how you can set up these animations, they can get extremely complex. It's kind of cool, some of the stuff that we can now do with animation in CSS3. I highly recommend you go in and read through it. This add keyframes, and we can have multiple animations, and that's why we're actually assigning it an animation name, animation to, because we're actually setting up each animation individually. So if we save those changes into our example_4, I'm going to go ahead and scroll up. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type those in. And now when we refresh, let's go back and refresh our browser window and load up number 4. You'll actually see now we have that animation and that cube now. It's going to run 360 degrees, then it's going to stop and rotate back. 360 degrees, and it's going to stop and rotate back, and it's going to do that for 20 seconds. And if you think that's too long, you can actually shorten this. We can actually make it 10 seconds. Save that change, refresh the browser, it'll jump back to the beginning, and now it's going to rotate quicker because we've actually taken a lot of the time out. We can actually make it 5 seconds if we wanted, but that's going to be a little too quick. You're not really going to see a lot. But again, you get an idea of how much power we have now inside this animation. One thing I do want to point out, I'm actually going to make it 30 seconds so I can point out something we've done when we set this up. One thing I do want to point out is notice as we look through this hole, because of our padding, we can actually look through and see the opposite faces of this particular cube. So we can actually look through those corners and see the opposite faces. And that's one of the reasons why I actually left that 10 pixel gap on each side, because it's actually giving us 20. We have 10 pixels on one corner, 10 pixels coming into the other corner. So it's giving us a 20 pixel gap on the corners. Looks kind of cool. In our next tutorial, we're actually going to take this a step further. This was kind of cool to see how we can actually build a cube and get it to rotate. But in the next tutorial, we're actually going to build a cube and we're going to control what face is showing. And I'm going to show you how we can actually put information on those 6 different faces. So you can get a whole lot of information in a small amount of space on your web page. And that'll be what we're going to cover in the next tutorial on 3D transforms. So I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. All right, one thing I want to do before I wrap this up, because I'd almost forgotten, I want to show you how you can actually enter your fallback code in the event you actually want to put this on a site and you can use it with all the different browsers that are out there. Because we actually used Firefox for all our demonstrations because it didn't require any. But if I wanted to run this, and for instance, if I want to run this in Opera, if I come back here and go ahead and load up example 4 in Opera, you'll notice we don't have any animation. And I'm going to have that same issue if I bring it up in Google Chrome. If I come up here and load this in Google Chrome, again, you'll notice we have no animation. So what we need to do is we actually need to do some fallback code for Opera, for Google Chrome, and for Internet Explorer. So let me go and show you how we have to do this to get this to work. First thing we do is we come up into our cube where we have the Transform Style Preserve. Well, before we do anything else, let's go ahead and do a save as so you can actually have both copies of this in the event that you do have access to the exercise files. You'll have the one that we set up in Firefox, and you'll have the one that we're going to actually put together with all the fallback for it. So right up in here where I have my cube, where I've set up all the coding for my cube, I'm going to go ahead and load this up now inside of, we'll bring it up inside Opera. So I'm going to bring up example number 5 in Opera. You'll see we have no animation currently. And we've got example 5 loaded. That's the one that we're actually working on. So I'm going to go up into Cube, and the first thing I want to do is I want to set the fallback for my Transform Style Preserve 3D. I'm not going to type this in. I'm just going to go ahead and copy it from the exercise file, but I will give you an opportunity to type it in. I'm going to come right below that with, and I paste in 3 additional lines of code. And then I'm actually going to put some additional spaces in here to keep this separated so you can actually see what we're doing. So I've got my WebKit, my Microsoft, and my Opera web rendering engines. And you'll notice I've got my prefix before the transform style for all 3. And those all 3 pertain to the Preserve 3D effects inside of CSS3. One thing I want you to notice, we've got the prefixes prior to the standard syntax. Always make certain your standard syntax is last. So it'll work through these 3 and determine which is the best one for the current rendering engine. And it'll look through WebKit, MSO, and then it goes to the last one by default if all the other ones aren't required. Then what we need to do is right below that, where I have the Transform Rotate X, I'm going to put an additional line, and I'm going to put in my 3 fallbacks for that particular one. Okay, let me put a couple additional lines in there. So now I've got my Preserve 3D and my WebKit Transform Rotate X and Rotate Y. And again, this is all part of the cube itself. This is all part of the animation sequence for this. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. And then I've got one other thing I need to do. And I actually have to do this for the animation. The same thing that we've done with our Transform Rotate X and Rotate Y, we have to do the same thing for the animation. And again, same prefixes. We've got the WebKit, the MS, and the Opera. And all we're doing is we're going in front of the animation. We're putting the prefix just prior to the animation. Save all those changes. Refresh my browser window. We still don't have anything working yet because we're missing one more thing. We need the WebKit for the actual animation itself. I'm going to go ahead and grab that. And I'm going to come right above our keyframes animation 2, and I'm actually going to put in the WebKit keyframes animation for that also. I'm going to save all those changes. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type all that in. Now when I go in here and refresh for my Opera, we now have animation inside of Opera. If I were to bring up Google Chrome, I'm going to go ahead and refresh Google Chrome, load example 5. We now have our animation in Google Chrome. And of course, we always had it inside of our Firefox, so it was always there for Firefox. So now you've seen how we can actually set up the fallback for the older browsers or the browsers that still need a prefix to use the transforms inside of CSS3. And now in the next tutorial, we're going to do what I spoke about just before I wrap this one up. We're going to go into doing another cube, but this cube you're going to have much more control over because you're actually going to be able to control which face is shown, and it gives you the ability to put 6 times the amount of information in the same amount of space on your web page. And I'm actually going to make it a little bit more interesting because not only are we going to do some stuff with text, but we're going to do stuff with text and graphics so you can see how you would actually want to use this on a live website. So I look forward to seeing you in that tutorial.